It was a quiet, foggy morning on February 15th, 2006, in the small town of Greenfield, Oregon, when the body of 29-year-old Clara Harris was discovered in a shallow grave behind St. Michael's Church. The town was left stunned. Clara was well known and loved, a beautiful, kind-hearted woman who had recently moved to Greenfield with her husband, Thomas Harris, and their 3-year-old daughter, Lily. The news of her murder spread quickly, unraveling a web of secrets that no one had seen coming. Clara had been an enthusiastic member of the church, often seen attending Sunday Mass and volunteering for community events. But beneath the surface of her perfect life was a forbidden affair that would ultimately lead to her tragic demise. Clara had fallen in love with the church's priest, Father Henry Collins, a 52-year-old man with a gentle voice, a kind smile, and a past he had desperately tried to bury. Father Henry had served St. Michael's Church for over 15 years, becoming a pillar of the community. Parishioners respected him for his wisdom and the comfort he provided in times of need. However, few knew about his troubled history. Before moving to Greenfield, Henry had been involved in a scandal at his previous church, a scandal involving another young woman who had died under mysterious circumstances. The church had quietly relocated him to avoid public scrutiny, and in Greenfield, he had hoped for a fresh start. When Clara first met Father Henry, she was struggling with loneliness. Thomas was a successful contractor who often traveled for work, leaving Clara to manage their new home and care for Lily alone. Despite the appearances of a perfect life, Clara felt increasingly isolated, yearning for connection. It was during one of her lowest moments that she confided in Father Henry, seeking guidance and solace. Their relationship began innocently, with Father Henry offering a listening ear and words of comfort. However, as their conversations grew more personal, a deep bond formed between them, one that soon crossed the boundaries of priest and parishioner. Clara found in Henry what she lacked in her marriage: attention, understanding, and the thrill of a forbidden connection. For Henry, Clara was a beacon of light, a chance to feel alive again, even as he knew their relationship was a dangerous, sinful secret. Their affair was filled with secrecy and stolen moments. They met in the church's back rooms, in Clara's car, and occasionally in a secluded cabin that Henry had discovered years ago. The thrill of sneaking around only intensified their desire, but with each meeting, the walls around their secret began to crack. Henry's demeanor started to shift. The gentle priest became increasingly possessive, wanting more of Clara's time and attention. He pressured her to leave Thomas, convinced that their love was worth the risk. Clara, torn between her loyalty to her family and her desire for Henry, found herself trapped in a web of lies that grew tighter with each passing day. The tension reached its peak one fateful evening when Clara and Henry argued in the church's secluded garden. Henry, desperate and increasingly unstable, demanded that Clara choose him or her family. Clara, overwhelmed and scared, promised she would leave Thomas but needed time. Henry's dark past haunted him, and the fear of losing Clara began to consume his every thought. The next morning, Clara disappeared. Thomas reported her missing after she failed to return home from what was supposed to be a quick trip to the grocery store. The police initiated a search, and it wasn't long before Clara's car was found abandoned near the outskirts of town. Inside, officers discovered a trail of clues: her purse, keys, and a crumpled note in Henry's handwriting that read, "Meet me where it all began." As the investigation into Clara's disappearance gained momentum, the police began to piece together her final days. Detectives questioned those closest to her, including Thomas, who appeared devastated and confused by his wife's sudden vanishing. But as officers dug deeper, they uncovered a side of Clara that no one had known, a side that involved secret rendezvous, hushed phone calls, and a relationship that would shock the entire community. Father Henry was brought in for questioning after witnesses recalled seeing Clara and the priest together more frequently than seemed appropriate. At first, Henry denied any wrongdoing, insisting that his relationship with Clara was purely spiritual. But the discovery of the note in Clara's car made it clear that Henry knew more than he was letting on. The pressure mounted. Henry's facade began to crumble. Faced with mounting evidence and unable to bear the guilt any longer, he confessed to his affair with Clara, admitting that they had met in secret at a cabin in the woods. He claimed their last meeting had ended in an argument, but he swore that when he left, Clara was still alive. The police searched the cabin, finding traces of Clara's belongings scattered around: a scarf, a hairpin, and a lipstick, all too personal to be left behind by accident. However, it wasn't until they widened their search to the church grounds that the full horror of what had happened became clear. Behind the church, in a shallow, hastily dug grave, they found Clara's body. She had been strangled, her face bruised, and her hands showing signs of a struggle. The community was stunned. The image of the kind, gentle priest was shattered, and rumors spread like wildfire. As the details of the affair became public, the town turned against Henry, who was arrested and charged with Clara's murder. However, Henry maintained his innocence, insisting that he had left Clara alive and had no idea who would want to hurt her. Thomas, overwhelmed with grief and anger, attended every court hearing, his eyes never leaving Henry. Despite his heartbreak, he wanted answers. He needed to know why his wife had been killed and what role Henry had played in her death. But as the trial unfolded, the truth proved to be even more complicated than anyone had imagined. The prosecution painted Henry as a manipulative predator who had preyed on Clara's vulnerability, leading her into a destructive affair that ended in violence. They argued that when Clara tried to end the relationship, Henry snapped, unable to bear the thought of losing her. They presented evidence of controlling behavior and his past scandal, suggesting a pattern of dangerous, obsessive tendencies. Henry's defense, however, narrative. They claimed that Clara's death was the result of a crime of passion, not by Henry, but by someone who had discovered their affair and acted out of jealousy and rage. They hinted that Thomas, heartbroken and humiliated, might have taken matters into his own hands, unable to forgive his wife's betrayal. They pointed out that Thomas had no alibi for the night of Clara's death and that his anger towards her was no secret. The trial became a battle of accusations, each side trying to convince the jury of their version of the truth. Witnesses testified about Henry's erratic behavior and his desperate attempts to control Clara, while others spoke of Thomas's uncharacteristic anger in the days leading up to her disappearance. The courtroom was tense, each day revealing new, damning details that made it impossible to separate fact from fiction. As the trial drew to a close, the jury was left to decide: was Father Henry a cold-blooded killer who had finally acted on his dark impulses, or was Thomas Harris a man pushed beyond his breaking point, driven to a crime of passion by the ultimate betrayal? As the jury deliberated, the entire town of Greenfield held its breath. The courtroom had become a battleground of emotions, with both Thomas and Father Henry painted as deeply flawed men whose actions had led to Clara's tragic death. The question of guilt hung heavily, and the verdict would determine not just who would face justice, but also which version of Clara's story would be believed. After hours of tense deliberation, the jury finally reached a decision. The courtroom fell silent as the foreman stood, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. We find the defendant, Father Henry Collins, not guilty. A murmur through the crowd. Father Henry closed his eyes in a mix of relief and despair, knowing that although he was legally free, the stain of the scandal would never leave him. But the drama was far from over. With Henry acquitted, the police turned their attention back to Thomas. Fueled by rumors and the damning testimony from the trial, the community began to suspect that Thomas might have played a role in his wife's death. He was questioned again, this time more aggressively, and investigators searched his home for any evidence that could link him to the crime. However, no concrete evidence was ever found to charge Thomas. Despite the cloud of suspicion, he was never formally accused, leaving the case officially unsolved. The lack of closure haunted Greenfield, and Clara's death became the town's darkest, most whispered about secret. The once thriving community church fell into disrepair, its congregation dwindling as Father Henry left town, seeking refuge in a remote monastery to live out the rest of his days in quiet repentance. Thomas, unable to move past the loss of his wife and the stigma of suspicion, sold his home and moved away with Lily, hoping to start fresh somewhere far from the memories of Greenfield. But the shadows of the past followed him. Every town he moved to seemed to know his story, and every new beginning was tainted by the unspoken question: what really happened to Clara? Years later, in a rare interview, Father Henry admitted that he would always carry the burden of Clara's death, even though he maintained his innocence. "I loved her," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "But love, when tainted with secrets, can destroy everything. I only wish I could have saved her from this fate." Despite his acquittal, the court of public opinion never fully exonerated him, and he lived out his final years in solitude, haunted by the ghosts of his past. As for Thomas, his daughter Lily grew up unaware of the full extent of the scandal that had torn her family apart. She remembered her mother only in fragments: a kind smile, a gentle touch, moments of laughter that seemed to fade like distant echoes. Thomas did his best to shield her from the truth, knowing that no explanation could ever fully capture the pain of their shared loss. Clara's story remained a cautionary tale in Greenfield, a reminder of how secrets and lies can tear lives apart. The town eventually moved on, but the memory of what happened never truly faded. The case became a part of local lore, passed down in hushed whispers as a warning to others about the dangerous allure of forbidden love. Despite the years that passed, Clara's grave remained unmarked, hidden behind the now abandoned church, as if even in death she was destined to be a secret. The weeds grew tall around it, and the stones became weathered, but occasionally flowers would appear, small, fragile reminders that she was not forgotten, that her story, tragic and unresolved, still lingered in the hearts of those who dared to remember. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and comment. Don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling true crime stories.